So we're in the basement again, but we're not technically in the breeder lab. This is actually a little nook that we culture live foods in, or hide stuff. We're not talking about that. So over here you'll see these 4 like alien green jars. So we're culturing Moina in there. We've been getting a lot of questions about them, so I think it's time to finally address how we culture them here and how they can be cultured and the pros and cons of different ways of working with them. The simplest way that I've done that, and I was doing this at home, and initially at first, before the green water took off, was yeast, and now they're being co-cultured with microalgae. But what exactly is a Moina? Well, I'm glad you asked. Moina are a smaller cousin of Daphnia. I originally got my hands on my first starter culture of Moina a while ago. I don't want to talk about that. Through a laboratory supply company because they're smaller than Daphnia. So the original intent was to use them as a continuous culture alternative to baby brine shrimp. They're a little bit larger than baby brine shrimp, but not much, at least in the case of freshwater fish. As a freshwater invertebrate, these are not a viable option for saltwater baby fish, and there's a legitimate argument to be made that neither are baby brine shrimp, but that's a completely different discussion. So think Daphnia, but smaller. I'm kidding. I won't do sound effects. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about how they're maintained, how do you collect them to feed them to fish, and what goes into maintaining colony. Now, the first thing you'll notice is there are 4 jars. That's actually very important. The more you have, the better. I would recommend most people have 3 or 4. I can see you getting away with 2, but if you have 1 colony, you're not going to maintain it long term, because the reality is, at some point, the culture will crash. It's inevitable. It just happens. It's not. I won't say it's necessarily you did anything wrong. It's just that Daphnia and Moina are a boom and bust organism, and so when they bust hard. And so you need to keep them in the booming phase just so that they keep reproducing, the population doesn't plateau off, and then they stop reproducing. So, how does one go about that? In the case of these jars, I'm actually going to, I think this is the one I want to do. I'm going to show you how I start a new culture. So I've got this nice little brine shrimp net. Nothing fancy. It's just to collect the Moinas as I'm pouring them through. I'm going to keep a little bit of the original water. And then I'm actually just going to dump the rest of this. So one of the things can actually cause a crash in Moina is a phosphate spike. If the phosphate gets too high, it starts inhibiting them. And so that's actually probably, at least that's the hypothesis that a lot of people who maintain Moina, they think that's the most common cause of a tank crash, that you are harvesting from the colony. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't tracked it too hard. We are collecting these enough that we don't have too much of a problem. So I'm going to go dump this, and then I'll be back in frame, and I'm going to show you some fun little details about this jar, actually. And we're back. So it's actually argonite media from, calcium reactors, which is actually really important. So the metabolic processes of the microalgae that are growing in here, and from the growth of the Moina, is actually threatens lowering the pH, and that's really bad. So you need something calcium carbonate to counteract that. In this case, this is just sitting around here because we have media reactors, and it's super simple and easy for me. Other options would be like sand for reef tanks. If you have just like a couple pieces of small live rock, that would work. There are certain types of rocks like lace rock, small pieces of that would work. So anything calcium carbonate is actually a viable option here. You want something that buffers the water a little bit. And now, another thing to keep in mind is calcium carbonate is really important because the Moina themselves actually use it when they're, growing, because they have it. They're very chitinous, but they do have a little bit of a like crunchiness to them.
They're crustaceans, aren't they?
Yeah. Itty bitty bitty. Alright. Let's see. It's not a particularly big group. So, I'm just going to start this here. I'm going to pour in the water we saved in here. Now, in the case of culturing microalgae with your Moina, a good all-in-one supplement is helpful, just because it gives the algae a little bit of something. Used tank water would do the same thing. And then I top it off the rest of the way, as I mentioned, with used tank water. In this case, from our cichlid system, because the cichlid system has a higher pH, and that's actually really desirable for this entire thing. And then I just invert it and wiggle them all off, and there you go. You have a new culture. You won't want to harvest from that particular culture for a few days. You just want to give them a chance to bump up, because I probably pulled out like 50% of them. And then collecting them is a couple different methods. The turkey baster method is the tried and true, very popular. You just kind of try to suck them from the top. They are very noticeable to the human eye, but the nice thing is you'll notice this nice little bend there. That's actually because getting into these cultures is really easy with a little bit of a twist. You wave it around a little bit, and you see some little wiggly specks, and then you're going to have to turn the camera over here. And then the same deal, just wiggle it. And there you go. You have now fed Nothobranchius cortazii yellow. Starter setup, I would say 3 jars. 1 gallon jars are the easiest ones to work with. A lot of people pump air through theirs. I very clearly don't. Personally, I have not found it particularly beneficial. There is an argument to be made that it mixes stuff up better, so there's like an even distribution of resources in the jar. But my counterpoint to that is, have you ever, like, if you go, so we're in West Michigan here, whoever might not be in West Michigan is watching. So if you go out to any pond, you can find native species of Daphnia. Now I want you to go out and look for wild Daphnia and tell me what kind of ponds they're in. They're stagnant. So me personally, I just don't see that the benefit that the even mixing provides is worth the investment of the airline, the air pump that you would need at home. So I just think the jars themselves, and you're probably going to have to get a starter culture. If you're around here, you can come get starter cultures from us. We do provide that. The reality is they're not super common in the hobby. So unlike with Daphnia, which you can get starter cultures from like other hobbyists, you're probably going to have to go through like Carolina Biological Supply. I think that's the most readily accessible source for most people for Moina. That's actually how I got my first batch of them, and I've been going with them for I think almost 2 years now. So these are descended from that.
Light, fertilizer,
Yeah, that's
potentially a brine shrimp net.
Yep. The light and fertilizer isn't necessary if you're feeding yeast. And so when I say feed yeast, I mean like literally instant dry active yeast. And so the trade-off there is they're arguably less nutritious than the ones that are eating microalgae, but the trade-off is you don't need a light and you don't need to be fertilizing it. And you need to be very conservative when you're feeding yeast though, because it's very easy to overdo it and you'll just like basically like cloud them out. So like you know how instant dry yeast has those like little like specks, like little sprinkles. Yeah, every day or every other day I was feeding 2 or 3 of those sprinkles. Very little goes a long way. So I think it's just a trade-off there of whether you're trying to produce a lot to feed a lot like we're doing here and you want it to be highly nutritious, or you're trying to just produce enough to, like if you're bapping instead of mass producing, that I think the yeast is just going to be far more accessible and viable for most people. Well, anyways, if you have any further questions, leave them in the comments below, send us a message, or on Facebook, give us a call. We're also on TikTok. We have a podcast. We do deep dives into topics like this. So, until next time, I would say check those out. If you have any other types of videos you would like to see from down here, let us know in the comments below. I'm always open to suggestions. And until next time, have lots of fun and keep those hands wet.